What's up everybody, Commander Sanctum here, and today we have a brand new deck tech using the Mindskinner. The Mindskinner is a 10-1 nightmare for triple blue that can't be blocked and says if a source you control would deal damage to an opponent, prevent that damage and each opponent mills that many cards. This is definitely one of the more unique mono blue commanders out there. It simultaneously cares about doing as much damage as possible to an opponent, but is actually a straight up mill commander. When trying to come up with a way to optimally use the Mindskinner's mill ability, one theme came to mind that was also flavorful for Duskmourn's horror setting: sea monsters. Sea monsters like krakens, leviathans, and so on are generally very large creatures from a power perspective, meaning that hitting an opponent with one while the Mindskinner is out will cause a ton of mill for all opponents. This gives us an excellent way to get the most out of the Mindskinner's ability, especially in mono blue, which generally isn't very good at causing direct damage. I also like this theme, as sea monsters are historically mythical creatures that instill terror in those who hear about them, which fits right at home with Duskmourn's horror setting. Let's take a look at what kind of cards will make up this deck. To start out our roster of horrifying sea monsters, let's take a look at some that make it a bit easier to actually hit our opponents. Breaching Leviathan enters the battlefield and taps all non-blue creatures, which won't impact us at all, but will hopefully lock down at least one of our opponents, allowing us to get some attacks in to mill everybody. For 1 mana more, we also have Monstrosity of the Lake, which will tap down all of our opponent's creatures and keep them tapped down for their next turn as well, letting us get in a few likely unfettered attacks. Shipbreaker Kraken is excellent in situations where our opponents have any particularly pesky creatures, since it allows us to tap them down and keep them tapped for as long as the Kraken stays on the battlefield. Instead of simply tapping down our opponent's creatures, another way we can make sure we can get through with our big monsters is by making sure our opponents don't have any creatures at all. This can be done by bouncing them back to their owner's hand, clearing the way for our attackers. Hullbreaker Horror is one of those generically good sea monsters, as its spellcast ability of bouncing a permanent or even bouncing a spell is useful in so many situations. In most cases, we'll probably want to be bouncing our opponent's blockers so we can make sure we can mill as much as possible, but there may be some scenarios where we want to bounce a non-creature permanent that is messing with our game plan. Brindlin the Moonkraken is similar to Hullbreak Horror in that it bounces a non-land permanent when we cast a spell, though this requires the spell to have a CMC of 6 or higher. Since we're running sea creatures that tend to be high mana cost, this shouldn't be too hard to accomplish, making this an effective bounce engine for us. In most scenarios, Scourge of Fleets will effectively bounce all of our opponent's creatures back to their hands when it enters, depending on how many islands we control, completely clearing the board and allowing us to attack whoever we want to get the Mindskinner mill triggers. Eluge the Shoreless Sea and Charix the Raging Isle are both creatures that get bigger the more islands we control. Since we're mono blue, we'll have access to a ton of islands, so these creatures can get seriously big very quickly. And hey, the bigger the creatures we can hit our opponents with, the more everyone will mill, making our win condition of milling everyone out happen that much quicker. Fleet Swallower just straight up makes someone mill half their library whenever it attacks. The great thing is that it is an attack trigger, not a combat damage trigger, so it doesn't even have to hit the opponent to work. Since our theme is both mill and sea creatures, I'd be remiss to not mention the 2 cards that fit both of these themes perfectly, the mill crabs. Hedron Crab and Ruin Crab are both effective sources of additional mill to continually pressure our opponent's library counts. For this deck, Ruin Crab is by far the superior of the 2, since we don't care about milling ourselves, but Hedron Crab still deserves a slot since it's such a thematic card. While our main source of milling will be via the Mindskinner's ability and attacking with giant sea creatures, we want to make sure we continually apply pressure to our opponent's libraries, in cases where our monsters keep getting destroyed. To achieve this, we have access to a number of straight-up mill spells. Maddening Cacophony and Fractured Sanity both take out large chunks of our opponent's libraries when cast, with Maddening Cacophony taking out half of each opponent's libraries if kicked. Needless to say, this spell should always be cast with the kicker, as it's far too much value to pass up. Traumatize always takes out half an opponent's library, but only hits one person, making it a bit less effective than the Cacophony. Still, in cases where someone may have some sort of mill resistance in their deck, this can help make sure their library count stays as low as all the other opponents. Next up, we have the father of mill himself, Bruvak the Grandiloquent. Bruvak is an auto-include in pretty much any mill deck, since he doubles mill effects, and it's no different with this one. With Bruvak and the Mindskinner out, opponents will lose their libraries at an extremely quick rate. We also have Tasha's Hideous Laughter, which is a more variable mill spell, but can be great against decks that have a low converted mana cost, or one that has a higher than usual number of lands. The one downside to these giant sea monsters is that they're all usually very expensive. To help offset this and make sure we can actually cast them when we need to make sure we have enough ramp or cost reduction effects at our disposal. High Tide is the quintessential mono blue single turn ramp spell, as it makes all of our islands tap for 2 blue for the turn. This can greatly help us cast a few of our sea monsters in a single turn, or get out one big one well ahead of when we'd normally be able to. Kefnet's Monument and Sapphire Medallion both reduce our sea monsters' casting cost by 1 generic mana, with the Monument being specific to our creature spells, while the Medallion is for all of our blue spells. Kefnet's Monument also has the added benefit of making one of our opponent's creatures not untapped during their next untap step whenever we cast a creature spell, allowing us to keep a pesky creature tap down for as long as we can cast creatures. Sword of the Animist is more traditional ramp, as it will get us a land from our library whenever we attack with it. It also has the added benefit of giving our creature +1/+1, meaning if it hits, that'll be an additional card each opponent will mill with the Mindskinner out. It even makes our Mindskinner a little more resistant to being killed, though not by much since 2 toughness is still pretty low. Retraced Image and Mitotic Manipulation may look useless for Commander, since we can only play a single copy of every card, but serve a very real purpose: ramp. These 2 cards are the quintessential mono blue ramp cards, as they let us put a basic island into play, so long as we already have one on the battlefield. The chances of either of them missing is relatively low, as we'll be running a ton of basic islands since we're mono blue, making them effective ways to ramp out lands early in the game. Finally, we have some good utility cards to help us with our giant creature mill game plan. Since we're going to be pretty heavy on the Sea Monsters theme, Quest for Ula's Temple will be a great way to try to cheat them in, so long as we can get up to the 3 counters required. Once we do, however, being able to play 8 to 10 drop creatures for free will be absolutely game changing. Speaking of cheating big creatures in, Quicksilver Amulet is another way to effectively do this, all for the low cost of 4 mana. While this isn't free like the quest, paying 4 mana instead of 10 is still a significant advantage and too good to pass up. Cage Sun is another good ramp source, acting as a permanent High Tide mixed with an Anthem for our creatures. More mana means we can get our sea monsters out quicker, and an Anthem effect means they're bigger, making them mill our opponents more when they hit. Inundate and Whelming Wave are going to be pretty effective one-sided board wipes in most scenarios, impacting us minimally while, hopefully, hurting our opponents immensely. It is important to note that the Mindskinner is a nightmare, not one of the sea monster creature types, meaning that it also will be bounced with Whelming Wave. That being said, it does only cost 3 mana, so it should be pretty easy to replay after casting Whelming Wave, allowing you to still use its ability for any sea monsters that remained on the field. Here's an example deck list utilizing all the previously mentioned cards. It includes a number of other great sea monster creatures, such as Serpent of Yawning Depths and Slinvote of the Rising Deep, additional ramp to cast said sea creatures in Terrain Generator and Burnished Heart, and protection for our Mindskinner in Lightning Greaves and Winged Boots. As far as mill commanders go, this one is by far the most unique and interesting. Turning all sources of damage into mill really does unlock the potential for mill as a strategy, especially in a format where decks are 100 cards. The best part about the Mindskinner is that it allows for various ways to build the deck. You could go small token creatures en masse, milling 1 or 2 cards per creature, but having such an army that it turns into potentially 30 plus cards every combat. Or you could try to go for the direct damage route, which while blue isn't very well known for it, would be doable by using pingers like Prodigal Sorcerer and trying to get as many activations in a turn. Still, I think the theme of sea monsters is going to be one of the best you can do. They're already some of the biggest creatures in blue, and they fit the horror theme of the Mindskinner extremely well. Not to mention, a lot of the sea monster cards are extremely powerful in their own right, letting you effectively clear your opponent's board of creatures or making it extremely hard for them to attack you. That being said, they are also expensive mana-wise, meaning this deck will be extremely mana-intensive and heavily reliant on drawing lands and ramp spells to make it actually function. It does help that the Mindskinner is 10 power for only 3 mana, letting you start the milling early while ramping up to the bigger creatures you'll play. Another downside of the deck, however, is that it is rather reliant on the Mindskinner being on the field. Due to the Mindskinner's unique ability and requirement to be on the field for the strategy to work, you may run into an issue where half the game you're milling your opponents, and then the other half you're basically just doing combat damage to them, since the Mindskinner may be getting killed consistently by your opponents. This puts you into a weird situation where you're effectively using two opposite strategies to try to win the game. When you're doing combat damage, all the mill you have done will have been useless, whereas when you're milling, you aren't doing any damage to your opponents, meaning they may still be at a very high life total. The key to the deck will be to try to be as consistent as possible with the strategy you've chosen, only playing towards that goal and nothing else. The fact that the sea monsters have such high power does mean that, if you wanted to forego the mill strategy altogether, winning with combat damage is still a viable strategy. That's one of the true positives of this deck compared to other mill commanders. With others, you're generally locked into mill as the only win con, whereas with this, you can shift to normal damage if need be. If having a modular mill commander is something you're interested in, or if you just love giant sea creatures and want to crash in with them, this may be just the deck for you. I hope you enjoyed watching this deck tech on the Mindskinner. The full deck list outlined in this video can be found at the Architect link at the top of the description. If you enjoyed this video, please remember to drop a like and comment, as well as subscribe to the channel for more Magic content. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.